Welcome to the Make a Mental Note podcast, where mental health professionals share information and perspectives that illuminate, educate, and is worthy of a mental note. And now your host, Chris Quarto.
Hi, everyone. This is Chris Quarto, and welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. Thanks for joining me. Well, the mental health tip for today has to do with dealing with procrastination. Some of these things that I'm going to share with you today come from James Clear's website, where he talks about the 2-minute rule. And if you think about it, a lot of the things that we put off doing throughout the course of the day, they're really not that big of a deal. They're not that hard to do. And we just come up with reasons for not doing them, whether it's, I don't have time to do that right now, or more likely, I don't feel like doing that right now. So this 2-minute rule overcomes procrastination and laziness by making it easy to start doing something so you can't say no, or it doesn't make sense to say no. Anyway, the first rule is this. If it takes less than 2 minutes, then do it right now. Whether it's washing dishes or doing the laundry, taking out the garbage, so many of these things, they're not that big of a deal. So if they can be accomplished in less than 2 minutes, then try it for the next couple of days. Just try doing those things and see what happens. Now, the other thing is we also have tasks that are a little bit more challenging and are more time intensive. Those are things that we put off as well. So the second rule is this. If you have a large project or a big task that you have to do, try to do a jump start and at least start on this for at least 2 minutes. Tell yourself that I only have to do it for 2 minutes. If I don't want to continue working on this thing or doing this thing after that, I don't have to. But I'm at least going to start on this and do it for at least 2 minutes. So in this case, what will happen is that you're sort of giving yourself an out. And psychologically, it's nice to know that I don't have to do this if I don't want to. But what ends up happening for most people is that once they make that 2-minute commitment, that 2-minute jump start, so to speak, that'll actually start the motivation process and get them going on this for probably longer than they expected to work on it or wanted to work on it. So that's my mental health tip for today. All right, let's get to our podcast interview with Kaylee Worley. Hi, everyone. This is Chris Quarto, and welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. Well, today I am joined by Kaylee Worley, who is a motivational interviewing trainer located in Franklin, Tennessee. And Kaylee, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Chris.
Well, why don't you start off by sharing with the mental note-taking audience a little bit about who you are and what you do for a living?
Sure. So, as Chris mentioned, I'm a motivational interviewing trainer. So about 90% of what I do is to train others in using motivational interviewing, which is a communication style that's kind of goal-oriented and helping people really resolve their ambivalence to this idea of change. So I spend a lot of my time training others in how to use the technique. And then another about 10% of what I do is actually see clients and use the technique of motivational interviewing to really help them resolve whatever kind of ambivalence or uncertainty that they might have towards whatever target behavior that they may be working on at that moment.
Fantastic. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the basics of motivational interviewing in a second, but what made you decide to go into this area of helping people, Kaylee? Because, there are a lot of different ways you can help, but why motivational interviewing of all things?
That's a great question, and if you could see me right now, you'd see the smile on my face as it's jogging some memories as I'm kind of thinking back to, what got me started in this field?
Yeah.
I think I was always drawn, like many individuals that are in the mental health field, to this idea of helping people.
Mm-hmm.
And it was when I got into, my own graduate school program, seeing clients when I got out and kind of being a first, time practitioner, really kind of discovering what is kind of my niche. I knew I loved listening. I loved helping, and what I was fascinated with was this idea that there's a language of change.
All right.
And that if you could understand effectively how to communicate with people, then you're going to get much further in a conversation than if you didn't really understand some of those particular nuances. So I became enthralled with this idea of, well, how do I then help specialize in helping others become better communicators?
Mm-hmm.
Because, we live so much of our lives interacting with people, and so much of what we do, I mean, you and I are even doing it right now, on a day-to-day basis, is just communicating with one another, having conversation. But how to truly have a conversation is an art form. Right? And so much of that art form, I think, is what encourages me and fascinates me to learn and grow and really get involved and immersed in motivational interviewing.
Well, I heard you mention 3 C's as it relates to this and to your decision and what you do. It's conversation, communication, and then that real important word, change. And you're right that I think that conversations we have, not only with clients, but I think just with people in general, people who are trying to get a point across or trying to get people to maybe to persuade people or whatever their professions are, oftentimes they're trying to get people to look at something to kind of motivate them to change. And it sounds like that motivational interviewing has a lot to do with that.
Absolutely. It's really kind of the core skill, if you want to think of it that way, that helps, from a practitioner standpoint, understand and kind of navigate a conversation so that you're in a guiding position, so that the individual that you're talking to is really the individual that's making the decision to change, which is the best case of both worlds.
Okay. Well, why don't you share with the mental note-taking audience a little bit about some of the basics of motivational interviewing? Is this something that any therapist could use, and what are some of the basics?
Sure. So motivational interviewing is by nature open to the entire public, so actually anyone can learn about motivational interviewing.
Okay.
So one of the things that I think is kind of important to understand is just to learn a little bit about, well, why was it created in the first place?
Yeah.
So Dr. William Miller and Steve Woolnick are the founders of motivational interviewing. They came out with this in the 80s, kind of similar time frame to when James Prochaska would have come out with the trans-theoretical model. So kind of similar time frame for those of you that are kind of history buffs around the world of psychology.
All right.
They came out of it after looking at the world of addiction and helping people who were really struggling with, alcohol or drug addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point in time in history, that the types of therapies that were available to helping those individuals were pretty staunch, very directive, almost let me guilt you into treatment, as opposed to what Dr. Miller and Dr. Woolnick came out with, which is a really person-centered approach to conversation. And so out of that came motivational interviewing and kind of some of those core components, which is this motivational interviewing spirit, which I know when I say that, many people think of different things here. What that's really talking about is kind of the headset and the heart set by which you might approach people, because people react to you differently based on how you approach them. I'm sure everyone that might be listening could think of an individual in their own personal lives that, wanted to positively influence them, but for whatever reason, you resisted their attempt.
Right.
A lot of that was in their approach. Very similarly, I'm sure the audience could think of people who would want to positively influence their life, and yet they allowed them to. Again, the difference was the approach. And so kind of foundational to motivational interviewing is that spirit, the way in which you approach people. Kind of some of those micro skills that roll up into that is really understanding one of those 3 C's that you mentioned earlier about change, and it's that language of change. We all talk with multiple languages. So one language that we might talk from is around the idea of change. I'd like to exercise, or I'd like to eat healthy. I'd like to not be as stressed.
Right.
And that's towards the idea of change. Very similarly, you'll often hear people follow up that statement with a but. I'd like to exercise, but I don't have time.
I don't have enough time,
Exactly. So whatever's coming after that but is kind of that sustain or that rationale for maintaining their status quo at the moment. Understanding that language of change is really what makes motivational interviewing a great communication style, because then the job of the practitioner or the individual who's using motivational interviewing is to really evoke and cultivate more of that changed language. And so they might be doing that through the use of open questions, some reflective listening, giving up an affirmation, so offering some descriptive praise for the things that the individual may be doing well, summarizing. So some of those more patient-centered skills that many who are in the mental health community are familiar with when talking, but using them in a very direction-oriented towards that language of change.
Yeah, it's, you hear of therapists, especially younger therapists, when they're first entering the field, how they get frustrated with clients who are resistant. And they say, why isn't the client doing, what I'm suggesting to them to do? If they would only do that, they wouldn't have this problem anymore. And, what you said earlier in terms of how people with addictions used to be treated or counseled was really, when I was being trained, it was really a confrontive type of approach.
Yep.
But I guess what I'm hearing you say with this approach, it's radically different, isn't it? It's not the confrontation, and it really is not, it's not necessarily looking at a client as being resistant, is it?
It's really not. It's allowing the client to be the individual who determines their own motivation. They get to strengthen that motivation through conversation with the practitioner or therapist that they're working with. And they get to really be the decision maker behind what's the right next step for me, the individual seeking treatment.
Okay. So is there a specific process that's used in when you're dealing with somebody who has, who's using motivational interviewing? Is there a process that they go through, or anything else that you might be able to kind of help us understand relating to this approach?
Yeah, so I would say that definitely, if you think about why motivational interviewing was created, it was to help people resolve kind of that two-way feeling. Right? The idea of I'd like to change and then the but.
Yeah.
And so if you're resolving that, then you're just gearing after more of the change. And so if there's a process to it, it's kind of a 4-step process.
All right.
The first part is we're going to have to engage with the client, right? And there's many things that go into engagement so that you build that foundational mutual trust to be able to move forward in a conversation. Kind of that next step of the process, if you're thinking of the staircase and we're kind of ascending the staircase, that second step is really about focusing the conversation. Having both the therapist and the client at the moment thinking through, well, there are many different options of which we even could be talking about, again, relative to whatever that change may be, right? So if it's the idea of I'm seeking treatment as the change, one option is I could go to treatment. Another option is I could not. I could go inpatient, I could go outpatient, right? And you just kind of look at what are those options that we might be talking about. We agree to whichever one we want to talk a little bit further about. Okay. And we move to that third step of our staircase. And that's really where motivational interviewing shines, and that's where that evoking comes from. And so when you think about evoking, we're drawing out from somebody their own reasons for change. We're drawing out their ability to change, their desire to have a different outcome, perhaps even their need for wanting a different outcome, if we're thinking about some very specific health behaviors. And then finally, we're moving to that 4th step of the process, which is, if appropriate, what is the next step or the plan that's going to be in place? If we haven't in the conversation drawn out enough of those reasons and motivation for the client, you won't ever really get to that pinnacle point of creating a plan, because that third step is so pivotal to the process.
Right. So some of these skills are actually skills that most helping professionals would learn in graduate school. Just some of those real basic listening skills and reflection and some of those skills. But it kind of goes beyond that. And I wonder, as I was listening to you talk about this, how this relates to the stages of change. I think you had mentioned that earlier in our interview about how people can be at this place where they're not really wanting to change. They don't want anything to do with it. Does this process that you described help them work through those stages of change?
That would be a resounding yes.
Okay.
So if we think about the trans-theoretical model and those stages of readiness or change, that pre-contemplation, now I'm just really not even thinking about this, not even in the next year. That contemplation, I'm thinking about it, but I haven't done anything yet.
Okay.
And even kind of that preparation, okay, well, I've made a decision to do it, but I haven't actually followed through on the steps. Those three kind of beginning phases is where motivational interviewing shines from a conversational approach to kind of guiding people through those stages of change.
Okay.
When you've got somebody that's kind of crested the hill, if you will, and they're in action or they're in maintenance, you may be using a different conversational approach because those people aren't ambivalent about anything at that moment. They've already made the decision to change and they're ready to act on it.
Sure.
The motivational interviewing is really more that precursor step, and it shines very beautifully kind of in those first three stages of readiness.
Okay. Well, you said that you had a small practice, and I'm wondering what kind of clients that you've used this approach with, and how much success you've had using this approach.
Absolutely. So my clientele is really coming to me generally for 2 to 3 different major themes. The first theme is an imbalance in work and life. They're feeling overwhelmed, stressed, anxious about that imbalance, and they're really wanting to figure out, well, what do I do? Because if I knew that answer, I wouldn't be coming to you. Right? So they're really seeking out I need help kind of sorting through my thought process here. A second kind of theme that kind of comes out in the clientele that I work with is they're making some sort of life transition. Whether it's an empty nester or I'm now going into retirement and there's just a lot of angst or uncertainty, if you will, around what do I even want that to look like. And so because they can't envision it, therefore they're putting on the brakes from making that life instance happen. Or either that life instance from the empty nester standpoint kind of was thrown into their lap and now they're going, well, oh my goodness, what do I do? And then kind of that third arm is just purely no matter where they are, their work-life balance may be fine, their transition or life transition is fine, but they're just feeling an overwhelming amount of stress. And they don't have any techniques or coping skills to be able to deal with that stress. And that's okay because we all learn those skills at different phases, right? What we may have learned when we were younger doesn't work right now because it's a different type of stress. So those would kind of be the predominant themes that individuals would come to me kind of seeking counsel on, well, help me kind of figure out what do I do here.
So you could be dealing with clients who aren't resistant, but still are unclear about what they want to do or really still questioning the whole change process, right?
Absolutely, right? And so they may not be resistant to the idea necessarily of seeking professional help or guidance. There's definitely resistance or apprehensive to this idea of, well, what does this mean for my life? What little steps of change may this impact? And this change is scary and really hard for a lot of us. And so that's what they're kind of struggling with at the moment. Yeah,
it sounds like those are common themes that you deal with these people, and some of those feelings that go along with that. The apprehensiveness, of course, because I guess that part of this is fear of the unknown with some of the clients that you're dealing with. What are some of the other feelings that these clients are experiencing, Kaylee?
So very honestly, some of them, especially if it's a work-life imbalance, could be feeling a lot of guilt. If work is pulling them in a certain direction and they have a core value of family or, just social support kind of from the outside, if that imbalance is that way, there is a lot of guilt that tends to kind of come up. Certain people, when dealing with that topic of just, I am stressed and I'm not real sure how to deal with this, one of the emotions that may come up for a lot of people is borderline on that depressiveness and just really experiencing going, I can't tell you if it's just I'm stressed and that's it, or if why I feel this way isn't so much the stress, it's the fact that I'm sad about the fact that I never learned how to deal with this. So So a little bit of depressiveness, maybe a little bit of shame around, well, why isn't this working for me the way it seems to work for other people?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then I would say maybe a third emotion that seems to come out in dealing with all of this, especially with the life transitions, is to what you said a moment ago, kind of that anxiety around that uncertainty.
Right.
And a lot of kind of projection into the future seems to kind of keep people paralyzed in the present.
As I listen to you, I'm thinking, some people may have certain approaches that they use very successfully to help people with anxiety and depression. And it's not necessarily motivational interviewing, but, whatever approach they use, they've been using it for a period of time. They found it to be successful. The thing that I wonder about is motivational interviewing something that complements other forms of therapy? I mean, if I practice like from a cognitive behavioral standpoint, could I use this in addition, or would it complement what I do from that cognitive behavioral approach? How about that?
Great question. So in 2013, Dr. Miller and Wolnick came out with the third edition of motivational interviewing, and it's a textbook, if you will. And in there, they outlined very early on, when you're learning to use motivational interviewing, kind of an 8-step process for how you should go about becoming proficient or competent in using it.
Okay.
And that 8 steps is really the core of what you're asking, which is, how do I take these skills within motivational interviewing and couple them with kind of the background for therapy that I've been trained in.
I see.
And so it bundles beautifully with cognitive behavioral therapy. If you come from a social cognitive theory or a trans-theoretical model background, it couples well with both of those. I've seen motivational interviewing work well from self-determinant theory. I've seen it work well with solution-focused therapy. So because motivational interviewing, or MI for short, really is a communication style, and it's the way in which you're exchanging information, it's the way in which you're helping guide someone to resolving that ambivalence. That's why it pairs so well sometimes with some of these other theoretical practices.
Sure. That's good to know. I think that a lot of people, therapists, would probably be more open to using this if they knew that, it's something that they could just incorporate into their general style or way of working with clients. And speaking of that, if you have a client, I always ask my guests this about, well, how do you move a client from point A when they're first coming in to see you to point B when they don't need to see you anymore? What is your recipe for success, Kaylee, in helping clients get from that point A to point B?
Yeah, so I'd love to kind of take this question and answer it twofold, since I wear kind of different hats from a practitioner and a trainer standpoint.
Okay.
So first, kind of just from a practitioner standpoint, how do I know? Well, from the framework of using motivational interviewing, and we're helping people kind of move forward or decrease their apprehension towards whatever change topic it is, a lot of times it's a very natural thing. From moving someone to point A to point B of, okay, now you're doing this on your own. Many times I find that it's the client themselves who's bringing this up and saying, you know what, I kind of feel like I have the tools now. And when you're using that reflective listening, you're picking up on those cues because you're paying attention to the things that they're saying. From a trainer standpoint, and really being able to help people move from point A to point B, this is why we offer motivational interviewing workshops, is so that we can help other practitioners really refine and hone their own skills at helping move clients from point A to point B so that it does feel natural in conversation. So I would say if there's anyone that's kind of listening into the mental note-taking audience right now that's curious about this, I would largely encourage you to go out and look for a motivational interviewing trainer who can put on a workshop for you to be able to learn this type of skill and process in communication. Yeah,
that sounds good. And actually, I'm going to put some information in the show notes about trainings that you offer to make sure that people can contact you if they want to. Now, In terms of challenges in working with clients, so you help them from that point A to point B, but I think we all know as therapists that it's not always a direct process. It's not a straight and narrow process, that things come up, things happen in the therapy process that can make it very challenging. So what are some of the challenges in using this approach or working with clients from this framework?
It's a really great question because everyone experiences this notion of change differently.
Mm-hmm.
And some individuals have a really strong reaction to it. And so I think it's always helpful, both from a client perspective as well as a practitioner perspective, to just remind everyone that change is hard, it's normal, and it's vital to our survival. Right? So the fact that it helps to tend to normalize what's happening at that moment and all of those feelings that we kind of talked about before.
Right.
They're pretty par for the course for what's happening, right? And the fact that somebody's willing to talk about it is a wonderful thing to affirm to a client that may be sitting in the room. I think the challenges piece of it is where I love motivational interviewing the most and why I'm drawn to this idea of communication as an art form.
Okay.
Because it's really about figuring out how do you dance with someone, right? In a dance, there's a leader and there's a follower. Both have to be working in unison for the dance to look beautiful. So very similarly in conversation, especially in a therapeutic standpoint, your client may be the follower, the practitioner is the leader or the guide in the moment of figuring out where are we going in this change process. You know you're not partnering with somebody in that moment when you feel like you're trying to wrestle them down and make them decide, well, you said you were going to do this, right? So kind of going back to what you mentioned a moment ago about some of those grad students kind of experiencing that tension. So I think just learning to dance is part of it. I think accepting people is another piece of it. There are going to be individuals that, you know what, they just choose for whatever reason that this isn't for them. And whatever this may be, right? Whether this is treatment or this type of therapy or this, and that's okay. Learning to accept that not everybody has to think the same way is a great way to be able to come into challenges and come out on the other side of them.
Yeah, and I think part of that too is kind of goes along with what you're saying is respecting the fact that people aren't ready to change or don't want to change, perhaps at that point in time. There may be a point in time later, but at this point in time, maybe this isn't where they're at, and to be respectful of that. And I think, for the younger therapist, it helps to take the pressure off, and instead of feeling like I'm the one who has to get this client to change. Kind of looking at it from the opposite side, it's really up to the client to make that determination if they're ready to change. But what I can do, being trained as a motivational interviewer, if I was trained in this approach, is to use the skills that I know that will help the client look at things to make a decision as to whether they want to participate in a change process.
Absolutely. There's that level of compassion that goes into it, that we're just willing to accept people for who they are and where they're at, and we're compassionate to that process, if you will, of change.
Sure. Well, Kaylee, this last part of the interview is what I refer to as make a mental note, and something that you feel, if you want to give a tip to the audience, something that you think that might be helpful for them, whether it's from the motivational interviewing standpoint or just any types of tips that you might be able to give the audience that would help them with their mental wellness.
Sure. So if it's all right with you, I'd kind of like to share just a 30-second story.
Yeah.
To maybe give an analogy of what this mental note might look like.
All right.
So in motivational interviewing, we have what we call the Michelangelo belief. And that actually goes back to the story of how Michelangelo created the statue David. And so kind of the story goes that there was a community individual that had just this gigantic rock sitting on his piece of property, and he wanted it gone. And so he donated it, and Michelangelo happened to be the recipient of that. And so, kind of legend goes that for days, weeks, months, Michelangelo chiseled away just at this ginormous rock and out comes the statue David.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the community individual went to go see Michelangelo, and when he saw the statue David, he just looked at Michelangelo in utter disbelief and said, how, what, and just could barely even formulate the words. And he finally said, how did you make this? And Michelangelo's response, which is critical, was, it was already in there. I just had to bring it out.
Huh.
And so we translate that in motivational interviewing to the evoking process.
Uh-huh.
And it's really helping people understand you already have within you what you need to change. It's the job of a practitioner to really help bring that out.
Yeah, that's great. That's great advice and great to think about. And I think that I'm thinking about some of the clients that I work with is it's getting them to believe that they have this within themselves and to help them recognize that and become aware of that. And because they're so often looking at some of the negative qualities that they have that they aren't really aware of the positives that they have inside.
Yeah, there's a lot of empowerment in kind of taking that belief and incorporating it into your practice.
Oh, yeah. Well, Kaylee, how can a potential client or if a professional wants to contact you about training or workshops, how can they get a hold of you?
So there is a motivational interviewing network of trainers organization. It's an international organization, and we do have a website, which is www.motivationalinterviewing.org. This organization was stood up by Dr. Miller and Wolnick in the 90s to really just provide fidelity to both the training and the practice of motivational interviewing. And so I would largely encourage, no matter where you are listening to this podcast, you can find a MINT trainer listed on that website or a MINT practitioner on that website. And I know my contact information is there as well.
Okay, that's great. Well, Kaylee, I really appreciate you coming on today. This is good stuff. I wish more people knew about this, but I suppose the word is getting out now, and maybe more people will learn and incorporate this into their practice. But thanks for joining me today on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay, thanks. All right, I don't know about you, but I sure learned a lot about motivational interviewing. Really appreciate Kaylee coming on today. The mental note takeaway from today's episode is motivational interviewing focuses on conversations pertaining to change. And the role of the helper is to cultivate change talk, which can be done using counseling skills that all of us use on a daily basis, such as open-ended questions, making reflective listening responses, affirmations, summarizing. These are key to helping people change. Now, here's my question for you. In which stage or stages of the stages of change model is motivational interviewing most helpful? Remember, Kaylee had talked about 5 stages of this model. And the first 3 really pertain to motivational interviewing. So pre-contemplation, I'm not thinking about change. Contemplation, I'm thinking about change, but I haven't done anything yet. Preparation, I've made a decision to change, but haven't followed through on the steps. So motivational interviewing helps with the decision-making process. It also helps clients move in the direction of change if that's what they decide to do. So good food for thought. Well, if you'd like the show notes from today's podcast interview, please visit my website, chrisquarto.com. And other than that, you have a great rest of the week.